Good morning. I'm Reverend Michelle Scott-Huffman. My pronouns are she and her. I am a middle-aged, pale woman with spiky dark hair, gray pants, and for an exciting turn, a maroon shirt with polka dots today instead of plaid. So I want to say that first of all, either the time change has hit us hard, or we just don't want to talk about vulnerability. So it could be either or both of those things. I also want to say that I'm going to say things today that will be hard to hear. And so I want to invite you into a space of openness. I'll say that again, but I think it bears being said a couple of times. I will leave right after church today to go to Alabama on a racial justice pilgrimage, and we'll spend time this week in Birmingham and Selma and Montgomery. And given the topic of vulnerability and the way that that sort of wraps itself around the writings of primarily white people, and leaves some other people sort of in a space to try and figure out what that means. I think it would be disingenuous for me to not address that, having addressed the topic of vulnerability and courage last week. So we'll be talking a little bit about the broader conversation about what that means for people who maybe struggle to see themselves in that work. Brené Brown took the world by storm a few years ago with the release of her 2010 book, The Gifts of Imperfection, and even more so by her 2012 book, Daring Greatly. It was then that the popular use of the word vulnerability became less about the likelihood of a cyber attack on a business or the possibility of identity theft, and more about what some people might call showing up bravely in spaces that previously stoked fear and or shame in us. Brown writes that the phrase daring greatly is from Theodore Roosevelt's speech, Citizenship in a Republic. She says, this is the passage that made the speech famous. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, the one who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. Brown goes on to say, the first time I read this quote, I thought, this is vulnerability. Everything I've learned from over a decade of research on vulnerability has taught me this exact lesson. Vulnerability is not knowing victory or defeat. It's understanding the necessity of both. It's engaging. It's being all in. Elsewhere, Brown writes, owning our story can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it. Embracing our vulnerabilities is risky, but not nearly as dangerous as giving up on love and belonging and joy, the experiences that make us most vulnerable. Only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of our light. But Dr. Carrie Yazid, Dr. Jen Jackson, and lots of other African American women have said publicly and loudly that Brené Brown's message of embracing vulnerability is not a message for Black women, noting that society does not provide safe spaces for Black and brown women to be truly vulnerable and courageous. Now, I know this is not a surprise to some people in this room because you're reading or listening to the book, You Are Your Best Thing, Vulnerability, Shame, Resilience, and the Black Experience, edited by Tarana Burke, a Black woman and co-founder of the Me Too movement, and Brené Brown, a white woman, researcher, author, teacher, and one who has profited greatly from her work on vulnerability and shame. Again, today I'm going to say some things that may be hard to hear. And I want to invite you to a space of openness and curiosity, If you feel yourself getting defensive, I hope that you will recognize that, name it, and push past it to get to curiosity and commitment. I want to say now that I'm going to name race and color and gender and sexuality of people to whom I refer to in today's message because it's important. It's actually the point of the message. And while it may make some of us uncomfortable, much, not all, but much, of that discomfort comes from our privileged desire to downplay the effects of those markers or identities in all of our daily lives. So as I said, the book, You Are Your Best Thing, is co-edited by Tarana Burke and Brene Brown. And it came about as a result of a text message that Tarana sent to Brene after wrestling personally with Brene's work on vulnerability and shame. Tarana says that she reached out to Brene after they had done Share the Mic together in 2020 after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Tarana writes, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were murdered. In private, I was having these really heartfelt conversations with Black folks who were just struggling. I can't watch any more of this. I can't take this anymore. I cannot. And in public, the conversation was, how can we get white people to be better? How can we get white people to be anti-racist? Anti-racism became the order of the day, but there was no focus on Black humanity. I kept thinking, where is the space for us to talk about what this does to us, how this affects our lives? And so I was thinking to myself that I really wanted to have a conversation with you. Burke goes on to say that she can't trust any anti-racism work that doesn't recognize Black humanity. And Brown is deeply impacted by those words. And so together they collect essays from Black writers who share personal insights on the struggles, vulnerability, shame, fear, and abuse experienced by people of color in America, as well as insights on the ways that those writers found to live a more fulfilled and humane life. In the end, the role of Brene Brown in this particular book is to use her privilege to lift up the lived experience of storytellers who might not otherwise have had that platform. And perhaps more importantly, to listen deeply and learn from those stories. She doesn't wrap it all up at the end with a nice bow made of her own teaching and wisdom. She essentially says, this has been a weakness in my work, and this is what I can do. What I've been asked to do to help bring these other viewpoints to light so that we can all learn from them. Friends, this is ouch and oops played out on a grand scale. We talk often in our covenanted small group spaces about the practice of ouch and oops, creating a culture that welcomes the ouch or someone drawing attention to a harm that has been done in real time, and further creating a culture that encourages the oops. That is the recognition that no matter how pure our intent, the impact fell short. And we have an opportunity to correct course, again, in real time, not leaving anyone to have to stew over the thing that happened, but giving everyone the opportunity for restoration and reconciliation. So how are we to think about the work of vulnerability as a church? I often remark that the work of ministry is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I think the work of vulnerability in a group setting is like that. We do our own internal work to seek out the places where we can step up with courage and lean into our vulnerability in ways that can help us grow and deepens our relationships to create more and more safety for others. And remembering the mantra that AJ introduced from the Soulful Homes materials last week, I choose when to share my vulnerability. We use our newfound strength and healing to show up for others. And we know when and where and how to do that because we're listening and paying attention. I was thankful this past week for a few people in the Missouri Senate who were listening and paying attention to the people most impacted by a handful of anti-trans bills lumped together into Senate substitute for Senate committee substitute for Senate Bills 49, 236, and 164, in which much of the Missouri Senate, none of whom are physicians or have consulted physicians, desire to criminalize gender-affirming health care for transgender youth. a handful of senators chose to filibuster to prevent the bill from coming to a vote, which ended in the adjournment for spring break 2 days early. They just gave up and went home. Thanks be to God. Sometimes courage and vulnerability is a choice that you know will create difficulty for you, but has the potential to make life better for someone else, or at least keep from making things worse. Things are already difficult for that small group of senators. There's not a lot that they can get done, but once in a while they're able to collaborate with others across the aisle, so to speak, on this bill or that bill. And the choices that they had to make last week have probably cut all of that out for the rest of the session. But they made the choice nonetheless. So having heard the outcry from young people and their families negatively impacted by this proposed legislation, and from those who love and support them, these 4 senators chose to go all in on this issue because they listened well enough to understand what's at stake. I'm convinced that if we spend more time listening to people whose struggles are different from our own, we will find ourselves exercising our courage more often and leaning into vulnerability in ways that make space for others. But so often, we're just far enough removed from the lived experience of others to rationalize and to justify the injustice and inequity that they're experiencing. Even if we wouldn't say those words out loud, we have to admit that there's something inside us that says, but if they just wouldn't do that, or if they just hadn't done that, or if they could just be more like this. Friends, that's the language of an abuser, right? If you hadn't looked at me that way, I wouldn't have hit you. So often, we do that in our heads. There's a principle of community organizing that says the greater distance you are from a problem, the more you can philosophize about it. I know that word you use, and philosophize is what we do. And so this particular part of the message is really, really important, because our philosophizing doesn't do anybody any good if it doesn't transform our hearts and move us to do something with our feet and our hands and our voices and our bodies out in the world. And this is where the dangers of courage and vulnerability culture come in. Feeling good about the progress that we've made in our own life and rewarded by those around us for our vulnerability, we begin to look at those with marginalized identities to join in the courage fest, to come out of the closet, live authentically as who you are, ignore the dangers that puts you in, and just step out with the rest of us. But for many struggling under the weight of intersecting oppressions, there is still no safe space for their vulnerability. Because as Tarana Burke says, we are vulnerable even when we have chosen not to be. We are always vulnerable, living without certainty and at risk. And as Mary Frances Winters writes, when it comes to the experience of living as a Black person in America, then is now. Jeff Coulard is a white man, writing about the rewards of public vulnerability in terms of likes, shares, and comments on his social media posts, acknowledging his position of privilege and power. He says vulnerability is a privilege afforded to the already powerful. Courage is easier when the consequences are fewer. The world doesn't need me to be vulnerable because I'm actually not. There are no significant material consequences to my claiming a viewpoint or questioning society's power structures. The world needs me to be accountable for the power I wield and to hold others to account to. What Jeff doesn't say, but is profoundly true, I think, is that too is the work of vulnerability and courage. It's just that the work needs to be done internally and processed with a group of others who have similar power and privilege. Following the model built by the organization Showing Up for Racial Justice, if Jeff really wants to lean into his vulnerability and talk about privilege and power, In a space where it will make the world better for those who don't share that power, he should be gathering with a group of his white, male, cisgender peers on a regular basis to honestly and vulnerably process what that power and privilege looks like in their daily lives, how it keeps others marginalized, and how to use it to make real change for the people closest to the pain. In diversity, equity, and inclusion work, this is called caucusing, and it's really important work. Likewise, as a white woman, I need to understand that white women's tears have shut down more otherwise productive dialogues about racism and white supremacy than anything else. And once that happens, a conversation that previously centered the experience of a person at the margins has now become about the person at the center, and all of the energy goes into consoling that person. And y'all, I've been that person. I'm still that person sometimes. That is not to say that our newfound understanding about our role in systems of oppression will not legitimately bring us to tears. It is to say that coming to terms with that is work that needs to be done with a group of people who share our life experience, so that when we are in groups of people with diverse life experiences, we don't need to cling so tightly to our own. It's kind of like in relationships. Sometimes we need couples therapy, and sometimes we need individual therapy. And usually we need both. But we need to realize that they have different purposes, and there's a time and a place for each of them differently. So for those of us for whom it is safe to enter courageously into vulnerable space and deal with our own stuff, we need to do it. And we need to do it now, because until we get really honest and clear about where we fit into systems of oppression, they can't be dismantled. There's a sign that I carry around in marches and protests that says, "Dismantling white supremacy requires disrupting white comfort." It's not the people who are blatantly racist and discriminatory that uphold systems of oppression. It's the people that know in their hearts, but allow their minds to continually justify the policies and practices that keep others down. MLK Jr. wrote in his letter from a Birmingham jail, "I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers the negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with the goal that you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. This is where the research of Brené Brown and others who study vulnerability and shame and courage is really important and helpful. When we can see the ways that learning new things elicits a shame response in us, which is what usually manifests outwardly as defensiveness or aggression, we can reject the shame. Let go of it, and let the vulnerability move us to restorative action. Action that creates a better, safer, more just, and inclusive world. Inclusive of race and class and gender identity and sexual orientation and mental and physical abilities or disabilities and every other boundary that can either divide us or unite us as a stronger, more diverse people. May it be so. Blessed be. and amen.